She was 14 years old, standing beneath a ceiling of gold and firelight, surrounded by 1,000 watching eyes. The banquet hall breathed like a living thing, heavy with wine, incense, laughter, and the low hum of power. This was the heart of the Persian Empire, where a single sentence could bend nations, where kings spoke and the world obeyed. She stood beside her father's throne, perfectly still, trained since childhood to disappear in plain sight. Then her father rose. King Xerxes, ruler of millions, master of lands stretching from Africa to India, lifted his cup high. The hall leaned forward. His voice rang with confidence sharpened by drink and applause as he swore an oath before gods and men. Any request made of him this night would be granted. It was theater, a performance of divine authority. The crowd roared approval. And then the impossible happened. An elderly general stepped out from the ranks of nobles. Artabanus, battle-hardened, ambitious, and old enough to be her grandfather, bowed deeply. The smile on his face did not reach his eyes. He asked for the king's daughter. The sound vanished from the room. Musicians froze mid-note. Even the torches seemed to flicker in disbelief. Across the hall, women lowered their eyes, already knowing what this meant. In this world, a woman's fate could be decided in a breath. The girl's hands began to tremble. Her mother covered her face. Xerxes did not speak. He stared at the crowd, at the nobles watching him closely, at the throne beneath him, the symbol of an image. He could not afford to crack. To refuse now would be to admit weakness. To break an oath would be to shatter the illusion of godhood that held his empire together. He did not look at his daughter. Seconds stretched into something unbearable. Then, with a jaw clenched tight enough to betray fear, he spoke a single word that echoed through the hall like a death sentence. Granted. Applause erupted, mechanical and cruel. The general bowed in triumph. The girl swallowed a scream no one would ever hear. In that moment, she learned the most devastating lesson of absolute power, that a father's pride, once crowned and worshipped, could outweigh a child's life. Her body remained standing in the golden light, but her story had already ended, sacrificed not to enemies or war, but to a king's need to appear unbreakable. To understand why no one stopped what happened that night, you must first understand the world that allowed it to happen at all. Xerxes did not rule like an ordinary king. He ruled as the king of kings, master of an empire so vast it swallowed continents. From the burning sands of Africa to the distant valleys of India, tens of millions lived and died by the movement of his lips. Ancient writers said his word was not guidance, it was law. A single sentence could spare a city from destruction or condemn it to vanish without record. In such a world, resistance was not heroic. It was unthinkable. The Persian court was not a place of comfort or family. It was a sealed machine of power, built on silence and obedience. Corridors were watched by eunuchs who owed their lives entirely to the crown. Servants listened more than they spoke, and what they heard was reported upward. Privacy did not exist, not for nobles, not for generals, not even for the royal blood itself. The closer one stood to the throne, the more dangerous life became. For royal daughters, the danger was constant. They were raised in silk-draped chambers, taught music, poetry, and grace, praised during ceremonies as jewels of the empire. Yet, in official records, most of them barely existed. Their names were omitted, their lives summarized only by who they married and what political advantage that marriage secured. They were not remembered as daughters. They were remembered, if at all, as transactions. A royal princess was not a person in the eyes of the state. She was a living treaty, a movable alliance, a body that could be exchanged to stabilize rival factions, reward loyalty, or silence ambition. Her value lay not in her voice, but in her obedience. And obedience was absolute. The irony was cruel. These girls wore gems worth entire cities, yet possessed less freedom than palace servants. A servant might hope to leave service one day. A princess never would. Her life belonged to the empire from birth. This was not cruelty hidden in shadows. It was cruelty refined into tradition. So when Xerxes spoke that single word, granted, no one rushed forward. No one shouted protest. The court did not erupt in outrage because outrage had no place there. The system had functioned exactly as it was designed to. And within that system, the girl called Amestris was never meant to be saved. She was born into a world where silence was survival, power was worshipped, and a father's pride could outweigh a daughter's future without breaking a single rule. Amestris was not born to the queen whose name echoed through inscriptions and court ceremony. She was the daughter of a secondary concubine, a woman of Bactrian blood brought into the palace as part of the empire's vast human machinery. In another household, that might have meant obscurity. In the Persian court, it meant something far more dangerous. Even among women carefully selected for beauty, Amestris stood apart. Ancient whispers described her as striking, not merely pretty, but arresting in a way that drew attention even when she stood silent. Attention, in this place, was never a gift. She grew up within the women's quarters, a world sealed behind carved doors and guarded corridors. Her days were filled with instruction. Dance until her movements became flawless, poetry until her voice softened, music until emotion could be expressed without words. Above all, she was trained in obedience, how to lower her eyes, how to still her face, how to exist without leaving a trace. One by one, other royal daughters disappeared. They were sent quietly to distant provinces, married to governors, princes, and allies whose loyalty needed reinforcement. Their departures were never announced as losses, only as necessities. The empire expanded. The court adjusted. Life went on. Amestris remained. Xerxes kept her close. She was present at ceremonies, where other daughters were absent. She stood behind him during audiences, visible but silent. Courtiers noticed. Servants noticed. So did men whose ambition sharpened whenever royal blood came within reach. In another world, a father's closeness might have meant protection. Here it meant exposure. It meant her face became familiar to powerful eyes. It meant her name, rarely spoken aloud, was quietly remembered. The court was not blind to patterns. When a daughter was kept near, it was never without purpose. And purpose in this empire always carried a price. Amestris sensed the danger. Long before she understood it, she felt it in the way conversations paused when she entered a room, in the glances exchanged behind lowered cups, in the sudden politeness of men who had never needed to acknowledge her before. She belonged to the king but not to herself. By the time the banquet of 479 BC approached, her path had already narrowed. She did not know the exact shape of what awaited her. She only knew that remaining visible in a world built on power was the most dangerous position of all. Her fate did not need to be planned. It needed only one careless sentence spoken aloud by the man who had kept her too close. 3 months after the banquet, the empire dressed the crime in splendor. The wedding unfolded beneath vaulted halls washed in gold and color. Silk embroidered with imperial symbols draped the columns. Jewels, so many they seemed to glow on their own, caught the light like captive suns. Priests chanted blessings older than memory, their voices rising and falling as if fate itself had been rehearsed. To the empire, it was a triumph. To those who watched closely, it was something else entirely. Amestris moved through the ceremony with the precision of someone trained to survive by concealment. Every step was measured, every gesture exact. Her posture was flawless, her face composed, her hands steady. She had learned this discipline well, how to look untouched while being undone. But her eyes betrayed her. They did not reflect celebration. They reflected distance, as if she were already far away, watching her own life disappear from a place she could never return to. Witnesses would later say it felt like watching a performance staged for an audience that refused to see the truth. Beside her stood Artabanus. He did not hide his satisfaction. His smile was wide, his shoulders squared, his bearing unmistakably victorious. He had secured what ambition had long denied him, not merely a bride, but a permanent blood tie to the Achaemenid line. Through her, his name would be bound to kings. She was 14. He was well past 60. Even in a court hardened by political marriages and quiet cruelty, this union unsettled the room. As lingered too long, conversations fell into uneasy murmurs. No one objected, but few celebrated sincerely. The imbalance was too stark to ignore, even here. As the procession moved through the corridors, whispers followed like shadows. The king had sacrificed his daughter, not for peace, not for alliance, but to protect his image. Servants murmured it behind lowered heads. Noble women exchanged looks heavy with understanding. Everyone knew the truth, yet no one dared name it aloud. The empire had rules for silence, and this moment demanded it. A mistress heard the whispers as she passed. She did not turn. She did not flinch. She walked forward, step by step, toward a future already sealed. This was not a marriage. It was a sentence pronounced in gold and enforced by tradition. And as the ceremony ended and the hall filled with ritual applause, one truth settled over the court with crushing clarity. The whispers were right. Once the ceremony ended and the music faded, the illusion collapsed. What followed was not marriage. It was confinement. A mistress was taken from the public halls of ceremony into a private world, sealed shut by command. Artabanus did not raise his voice or announce his rules. He did not need to. Orders were delivered quietly, enforced immediately, and never questioned. She was forbidden from returning to the women's quarters, forbidden from seeing her mother, forbidden from speaking privately with her sisters. Even shared spaces were denied. Letters she tried to send never reached their destination. Messages whispered through servants disappeared without reply. Some were intercepted. Others were never passed along at all. Within weeks, every line of connection to her former life had been cut. In Persian culture, this was not a minor cruelty. Female kinship was survival. Sisters, mothers, aunts. These bonds were the only refuge women possessed in a world ruled entirely by men. Artabanus understood this perfectly. That was why he destroyed it. A mistress lived under constant watch. Servants assigned to her quarters were not hers. They belonged to him. Every movement was observed. Every word weighed. Doors were never truly closed. Privacy was an illusion she was no longer allowed to believe in. She learned quickly that escape was not a question of courage. It was a question of possibility, and possibility did not exist. In desperation, she reached for the one authority higher than her husband, her father. Plea after plea was sent toward the palace. She had once called home, words carefully chosen, tone respectful, hope restrained but alive. She did not accuse. She begged for intervention, for mercy, for acknowledgement. Xerxes received them, and did nothing. To intervene would mean admitting his mistake. To undo the marriage would fracture the image he had built of himself as an unyielding ruler, a man whose word could never be reversed. The empire depended on that image, or so he told himself. So he remained silent, and that silence became heavier than any lock. A mistress waited for a response that never came. Days turned into months, months into something shapeless and endless. Each unanswered message confirmed what she had begun to fear. Her suffering was an acceptable cost. She had been exchanged, finalized, forgotten. Artabanus did not need chains. He had the king's silence, tradition, and law on his side. Together they formed a prison no wall could match. A mistress had survived the banquet. She had survived the wedding. But inside the cage she now inhabited, survival meant something else entirely. It meant enduring a life where the most powerful man in the world had chosen not to hear her, and where silence ruled as completely as any tyrant. Artabanus wanted only one thing from the marriage: an heir, not companionship, not loyalty, not affection, blood, royal blood, something that would bind his name permanently to the Achaemenid line, and protect his power from rivals who circled him in silence. A mistress was never treated as a wife. She was treated as a vessel. Physicians were summoned to her chambers, not to ask how she slept, or whether she suffered pain, but to calculate her body's usefulness. Fertility specialists arrived with charts and rituals. Servants carried bowls of bitter herbal concoctions meant to hasten conception. Ancient tablets would later record the payments made for these services, proof not of care, but of intent. Nothing was for her health. Everything was for succession. 3 years into the marriage, she became pregnant. For Artabanus, it was triumph. Sacrifices were offered. Plans were whispered. He spoke openly now of legacy, of sons, of his place among kings. For Amestris, it was terror. She understood the rule without needing it explained. A royal mother could never be released, never divorced, never freed. A child would anchor her forever to the man who had already erased her life. Her pregnancy unfolded beneath a weight that pressed heavier with each passing day. Servants noticed she ate less, then barely at all. She spent hours standing by the palace windows, staring into the gardens where she had once danced as a girl, tracing familiar paths she would never walk again. Tears fell often, silently. Fear lived in her eyes. By the time labor began, she was already exhausted. For 2 days the ordeal dragged on. Midwives whispered urgently. Physicians argued in low voices. Her cries echoed through chambers that offered no comfort. When the child was finally born, it was a boy, small, frail, struggling to breathe. Artabanus named him Xerxes. For 10 days the palace waited. Then the infant died. Official records would later attribute the death to illness, brief and convenient. Unofficial whispers moved through corridors like ghosts. Some suggested neglect, others something darker. No version could be proven. None needed to be. Everyone understood what mattered. The pregnancy had not saved her. The child had not freed her. Motherhood had only tightened the chains. When the mourning rituals ended and the palace returned to its controlled calm, one truth remained unmistakable to all who watched her move through the halls. Whatever hope Amestris had once carried had died with the child, and her life, already unbearable, had crossed into something far worse. After the child's death, whatever restraint Artabanus once pretended to possess vanished. The palace learned of it in fragments. Servants spoke in whispers, raised voices behind closed doors, cries cut short, days when Amestris did not appear at all. When she did, bruises were hidden beneath silk, her steps slower, her eyes fixed on nothing. Weeks passed where she was confined to her chambers, guarded more closely than before, as if her suffering itself had become a threat that needed controlling. Something inside her collapsed. She stopped resisting, stopped pleading, stopped asking for mercy that had never come. Words abandoned her first, then expression, then movement. She drifted through corridors like a shadow cast by someone who no longer existed, present only because the body still obeyed habit. Servants noticed the change immediately. The girl who once flinched at raised voices no longer reacted at all. Food was taken only when placed directly into her hands. Questions went unanswered. It was as if the person who had endured so much had finally withdrawn, leaving behind a shell that could no longer be broken, because it was already empty. Only then did Xerxes attempt intervention. Quietly, carefully, orders delivered without ceremony, phrased as suggestions rather than commands. He urged restraint. He reminded Artabanus of dignity, of appearances, of the need for moderation. Artabanus was unmoved. He reminded the king of a single, unchangeable fact. The marriage had been granted by royal word. By ancient custom, a husband's authority over his wife was absolute. To challenge that authority now would be to challenge the very traditions that held the empire together. Xerxes understood the trap. He had sacrificed his daughter to preserve his image. Now that same image prevented him from saving her. So he stepped back. 14 years later, the palace shook again. This time, it was Xerxes who fell, assassinated in a sudden coup led by Artabanus himself. The reasons given were many. instability, weakness, declining authority. But beneath them lay a bitter irony too sharp to ignore. Artabanus claimed the king was unfit to rule. A man so morally weak, he argued, that he had sacrificed his own daughter to protect his pride. The court listened. The conspirators agreed. And so the man who had destroyed Amestris used her suffering as justification to murder the father who had allowed it. Power changed hands. Titles shifted. History moved forward. Amestris did not. By the time the blood dried on the palace floor, she was already beyond repair. Broken not by a single blow, but by years of silence, sanctioned cruelty, and the knowledge that her pain had become nothing more than a convenient argument in someone else's rise to power. Artabanus was executed months after the coup, cut down by the same palace violence he had once commanded. Justice arrived swiftly and brutally, but far too late to matter. By the time his blood stained the marble floors, the damage had already been done. Amestris was 28 when the doors finally opened. On paper, she was free. In reality, freedom arrived to a body still breathing, and a spirit long gone. She was offered a place at court again. Private chambers. Servants who answered only to her. Invitations to banquets meant to signal restoration and honor. She refused them. She withdrew from ceremony, from celebration, from people. Days passed in silence. Then weeks. Sometimes she would sit unmoving from dawn until nightfall, as if time itself had lost meaning. Those who served her spoke softly, careful not to startle her. She ate little. She slept less. Words, when they came at all, arrived slowly, as though pulled from a depth she could no longer reach. Once, in an attempt at kindness, musicians were sent to her chambers. They played a melody she had danced to as a child, light, joyful, once filled with promise. The moment the first notes reached her, something inside her shattered. She screamed, not a cry of fear or pain, but something raw and animal, torn from a place untouched for years. She collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. It was the first time anyone had seen her cry since the night of the banquet. The musicians fled in silence. She never recovered from that moment. Amestris died at 36. Official records would later cite illness, their language vague and cautious. Modern scholars suggest slow self-starvation, or a depression so severe it consumed the body from within. The cause can be debated. The outcome cannot, because the truth is simpler than any diagnosis. Amestris did not die at 36. She died the night her father stood before his court, weighed his pride against his child, and chose himself. Her body continued to move through the world for 2 more decades, but her life had already been erased. Her name vanished from royal inscriptions. Xerxes lived on in history as a builder, a conqueror, a king who challenged Greece, not as the man who destroyed his own daughter with a single word. And that is the final cruelty of absolute power. The most devastating violence leaves no visible wounds. Only silence. Only absence. Only lives erased so completely that history barely remembers they were ever there.